you are talking about regional communities. Why is there a difference? Why is this distinction?
Really, what we need to focus on is the smart and focus terminology around there, because it doesn't make any difference if we call it a city or a couple of towns put together with 5 or 6 houses and a post office box. The bottom line here is, do they have access to the things that help them digitally evolve and be enabled and connected to the rest of the society?
Welcome to the Smart Cities Council podcast and its special series with our global thought leaders. Smart Cities Council's global thought leadership team is an exclusive group of subject matter experts driving policy and standards, setting industry trends, conducting research, and building and sharing knowledge to advance our mission. My name is Fanny Meles. I am the global thought leader for youth engagement at the Smart Cities Council. And today I welcome John Brooks to the podcast, who is the global thought leader for regional communities. John Brooks began his career applying technology in agriculture, deploying systems, creating the first computerized dairy farm in the late 70s and early 80s. In those early days, this technology increased farm production by over 30%, while also detecting cattle illnesses electronically, saving significant herd management costs. Following university and the military, he spent almost 2 decades in emergency services as a fire lieutenant and critical care paramedic, and later as chief and director for both public and private agencies. During his public sector service, John applied system status management, statistical modeling, to predict future community emergency needs. He created smart analytics that produced dynamic placement models for rescue resources, improving response times by over 49%. These efficiencies moved his public agency from being tax-supported to operating as a highly profitable, tax-independent enterprise agency. For the last 25 years, John has been an executive leader in data technology, working with over 300 telecommunications carriers in over 85 countries. He has extensive experience in data integrity and lifecycle management and advanced analytics, serving multiple industries, including smart cities. Today, he serves as the Americas CEO for Globetom, a leading provider of data integration platforms to support digitally integrated public ecosystems. John, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Very good to be here.
Let's start with an easy question. What does regional communities mean for smart cities?
Well, when you think about regional communities, you generally refer to communities that are those smaller cities and towns and rural incorporated governments and councils. Generally speaking, they have under 25,000 population sizes. Globally, it's important to keep in mind the magnitude of this. So globally, there's somewhere around 380,000 cities and towns and rural areas, with only 4,000 of those having more than 100,000 in population. So the important trends to keep in mind when you think about regional communities is that as the population sizes in these towns and cities and so on decrease in size, the number of municipal areas increase dramatically. In other words, it's a sliding scale. You've got very, very few large cities, but you've got an enormous amount of smaller rural jurisdictional areas out there. When you look at the size of those population centers, the number that sit under 100,000, under 25,000, under 5,000 rises dramatically. The other thing that's also important to keep in mind is the farther you move away from larger urban centers, the farther away that a town or village is located, the less income per resident is available, the less resources are available. So regional communities, from a smart city perspective, are those areas that are really not able to necessarily benefit from the influences of the larger urban areas. This can include all facets of micro-society evolution. So clean water, electricity, resilient buildings, strong educational opportunities, adequate and access to and adequate health care, and of course, access to technology and information. But, also hand in hand with all of those pieces and all those facets of micro-societies is the funding needed to support that kind of growth. Those regions, those communities really lack a lot of those resources to be able to make that happen.
Interestingly, the term smart city has city in the explanation, in the naming. However, you are talking about regional communities, not regional cities, not regional towns. You are talking about regional communities. Why is there a difference? Why is this distinction there?
Well, and smart cities is an umbrella term in a lot of ways. And when you look at the evolution of smart city as far as just a banner or a name, that's really changed quite a bit. If you go out and Google that today for the people that have access to Google, they'll look at smart city and they'll see smart city 1.0 and smart city 2.0 and smart city 3.0. That's all fine. It doesn't really mean a great deal. What this boils down to is how is a community, a jurisdiction, a city, a town, a county, parish, or whatever the designation is for that governmental jurisdiction, how are they able to enrich the lives of their population? How are they able to enable things like livability, workability, sustainability? You'll hear Smart City Council talk a lot about those three pillars of activities that really help determine and define what a jurisdiction is able to provide to their citizens, to their residents, to their visitors, to their businesses. And we talk about city, really what we need to focus on is the smart and focus terminology around there, because it doesn't make any difference if we call it a city or a couple of towns put together with 5 or 6 houses and a post office box. The bottom line here is, do they have access to the things that help them digitally evolve and be enabled and connected to the rest of the society?
So, what does smartness mean to you? Because you mentioned a lot of things: livability, employment, digitalization, services. What does smartness mean to you? If from the smart city term, we need to concentrate on the smartness instead of the city.
Yes. Coming from a technology background, I'm going to have some bias there. And a lot of that bias is going to be focused around smart being a technology enablement term. So when we think about what's been happening over the last essentially 35, 40 years, as we've watched technology really grow at a fast pace, a lot of that's been driven by mobile technology as we've come through the Gs, the 2.5G, the 3G, the 5, all the Gs. And what that's done is it's put more and more information into the hands of the consumers of those devices. And so smart has really wrapped itself around a digital transformation term that's been enabled by that hard technology, by fiber in the ground, by satellite, by mobile technology, and the city or the jurisdiction's ability to actually leverage that technology to provide and enrich their citizens, their residents, their visitors, and so on. What information can they use to connect with those people or those businesses? What can they use through technology to actually enrich their lives, increase public safety, increase all the different things that exist in urban environments right now that don't really exist in a lot of those smaller communities? So smart goes hand in hand with that digital transformation idea of how do we bring technology into the picture to enable and enrich all of those lives. Government has a big role to play in that. In some cases, the government has the only role to play in that because they're the only ones around. So those are all things that when we think about smart, again, I'm a technology biased person in that sense, but smart is a lot of different things. Smart is having access to all of the things in all levels of society that are available in the large urban areas. How do we ensure that we have those types of capabilities available to all the different community participants around the world? That's a big challenge, and that's a challenge that will never go away. The question is, how big of an impact can we make on it? How big of an impact can we make in smart things to help enrich and empower and enable the lives of those people that reside in those areas?
And then another question is, what does technology mean to you? Because I understand that you are from a digital technology background. However, you also talked about how to involve the community, how to create services for them, how they would use the information. And in my understanding, technology is a broader application of science and knowledge to solve problems. That's a very broad understanding of technology, which includes digital technology, but it's not narrowed down to that specific aspect. So what does technology mean to you?
Well, technology, so I give you an anecdote that might reflect my age a little bit. The wheel was considered advanced technology a long time ago. Now, I wasn't around when that was invented. I fully admit that. Fire was considered a technology advancement. But the bottom line here is that technology is any improvement that enriches society. That's a very raw and very basic definition. We've attributed that to digital technology over the last few decades because that's really been the driving force. In the Americas, that's been a driving force since the space race really got going. So back in the late 50s, early 60s, back in that time period, the technology was driving a lot of advancements in data, in capabilities and machinery and so on and so forth. So technology is at its rawest form, that ability to do something better than you did before, to use a lever that before you used to have to use your hands, to go through and actually use a mobile device to access a location of a store, to do anything that is made better, easier, faster, and more empowering than you could previously do it. So technology doesn't have to be about software or computers. Technology just has to be about an advancement that improves lives.
And coming back to the thing you mentioned about governments being the only actors which could help regional communities, I would like to argue with that because I am the youth engagement global thought leader for Smart Cities Council, and I would like to help our generation, the next generations coming up, to feel that they don't have to wait for the government to do something about the future of the city, to create smartness, to create something they want to be part of as their future. So I will throw back that question. What is the government's responsibility and role in establishing the future of cities? And what other roles are there for individuals to take up on when we talk about the future of cities and smart cities?
So there's a lot there to unpack. And I want to make sure that I'm going to take one part of it at a time, and then you may need a repeat part of that for me just to make sure we catch it all. Let's talk about government first. Government, and why I mentioned earlier that government may be essentially what we call here the only game in town. The smaller the jurisdiction, the less industry support there's going to be for that jurisdiction. As a result, the only support they're going to have available to them oftentimes is government. So what you're seeing now is government becoming the provider of utilities. A small city that I was in yesterday working with, they actually had to put fiber in the ground for all of their residents themselves because there was not an industry out there that was going to do it in a competitive way to serve their communities. So that's one example, and that's on the larger scale side. That's in the 50 to 100,000 side. That sort of becomes more prominent the further out you get. As you get closer to the population centers that are under 5,000 people, that are under 500 people. As you get into those smaller and smaller settings, how do you get technology to them? Oftentimes it's not worth it for a business to go out and engage and implant that technology. Therefore, it becomes the government's responsibility. So that's what I mean when I talk about sometimes the government is the facility to make that happen because they're the only ones in the area that can make that happen. Now, that said, the larger the environment is in terms of urbanization, I'm not a huge believer that government is going to be the best resource for a lot of that technology placement just because of speed to market. And there's a lot of red tape in government. There's a lot of red tape in every industry. So I can tell you that having worked in both, I don't necessarily see advantages to either one. I see disadvantages to both and advantages to both. Now, what I would also say, though, is for the youth wanting to get involved, and we can talk about this more here in a little bit, but I think there's a huge opportunity in remote, rural, and regional communities for the youth to take a look back over their shoulder at that, because today the youth are moving the other direction. They're moving towards urbanization. And there's going to be people like myself who are going to advocate, turn around, look into your rearview mirror, take a look at what's behind you and where the opportunities lie in those areas. Urbanization may not be the answer for a lot of those individuals. There's an attractiveness to that because urbanization has more people, more activities, more excitement, more technology, more, fill in the blank. It's all there. But is ultimately the things that they're going to find fulfilling in what they want to do with their career, with their families, they may not find that in urban settings. And if we're going to attract them to help promote and build and sponsor and enrich these other communities, these smaller communities and smaller regions, we need to make it attractive for them. What's going to draw them there?
I love that you want to empower the younger generation to choose consciously where they live based on what they are seeking, instead of just getting to the cities as moth to the flame because what everybody is doing. The other thing I wanted to touch upon is the infrastructure. You mentioned that the government is there to provide the infrastructure. And I would like to understand, what do you think about the emerging technologies which help us become decentralized, which means that maybe those infrastructures, maybe the fiber the government was laying down becomes obsolete, becomes unnecessary. For example, we use Starlink for our internet in our home. We don't need the fiber. And to be honest, it's a better internet than what we could have from the fiber, which is just mind boggling. And there are other emerging technologies which help such transition to involve more the rural communities into this kind of infrastructure without actually needing to build up that kind of infrastructure, that kind of investment from government. What do you think about this kind of change in the infrastructure management?
Well, I can tell you that I'm seeing it myself now within our own company, and to where we see, a lot of our workforce is able to work around the world in a remote environment. But the very next thing I say to that is that's a small percentage of the overall workforce's opportunity. And a good portion of the workforce is not made up of people that can work in remote environments. A lot of those people are needing to be hands-on, working in industry, working in factories, working in agriculture, working in a lot of these other areas that need that technology, but don't necessarily have the ability to work from home, so to speak. So, look at the agriculture community, to where today you can sit in a large piece of machinery, a large combine on a field in a farm, and literally not have to touch the wheel. And it is GPS maintained, and it is able to completely work that field and do its job. And that person doesn't have to do anything. And that's great, but they still do need to be there. And so we need to think about demographics and the type of workforces that we're going to have. It's not one workforce. It's, it's a group that's going to provide resources to all of that workforce need across the spectrum. So let's talk about technology for a little bit. I agree, fiber is not the end all be all. That's one example. It was the rage a little while ago, but then we started doing things with the Gs in mobile technology, and we started doing more with satellite. When the first satellite internet started showing up here 20, 30 years ago, it was horrible. And it was great for download, but it was horrible for upload. So if you wanted to push something up there, if you wanted to go shoot a YouTube video and put it up online, take a number. You're going to be there for a while. Plan your dinner, plan the next week, plan your vacation. It's going to take a little bit. But as that technology has improved, so has that ability to be connected from a lot more places than were available before. As we move through cellular technology, the interesting thing about cellular technology is that the higher the bandwidth gets, the higher the capabilities get, the more densified cellular technology has to be. So you think about, everybody says, oh, 5G, let's all do 5G. Great. You have to have 5 to 10 times the amount of density in towers and antennas than you did with 4G. So, those are the kind of things that we need to think about. That's not always practical to go put those resources into these regional communities. So now, it's also very easy to go through and plant 1 or 2 base towers in a region and have a bunch of picocells and femtocells attached to them and have them microwave back to a satellite, so they don't need hard fiber going from Brisbane all the way out to somewhere in the outback. You don't have to do that. But there still is a need to have that technology there, and that's where the satellite is certainly becoming more and more of an enabler and an empowerment tool. But we still have the same problem. How do we make sure that we have enough of the workforce that works in industries that can be remote to actually go remote? And that doesn't solve the problem of the industries that need to be remote. How do we get those people in the field doing that work, and not necessarily in a field, but out there in those fields, such as industries associated with agriculture, associated with mining, associated with energy production. Right now, we have a declining population in all of those sectors around the world, and that's a concern.
You have been alluded to your amazing experience throughout the decades you have been working in this area. What has been your journey? Why have you arrived to regional communities?
Oh, that's an interesting conversation. I've done more than my wife thinks I should have done in terms of not finding a certain career and settling on it. I'm not that guy. So it's been a fun trek. As you'd mentioned in the intro, my origination in agriculture is really something that I hold on to very closely. My family worked in the dairy industry, and we worked with farmers in remote regions all over the United States. And I started doing that as a small boy, 8 years old in the early 70s. I'm out there bolting together little boxes that we called computers. I didn't know what that was, but I was putting them together for my grandfather who ran the business. But it struck me even then the imbalancing gap that persisted in utilities like telephony services, products, educational opportunities, and so on, between what I had at home versus what these people experienced in these remote communities. I never knew what a party line was on a telephone, but that was common. When you had a telephone in a farmhouse, guess what? You shared the same phone line, same phone number with 5 other farmhouses across multiple farms. So when the phone rang, it rang at every house. And everybody answered until you figure out who it was, and everybody else hung up. So that's a party. I looked at that and I thought, oh my gosh, how do you live? And that's the kind of things that I started seeing. And that was 50 years ago. So later on in my career, when I worked for government, I worked as a county department director in a large resort area. But this really drove home some challenges for me because those communities in that resort county, we had 10,000 population, but that was scattered across 6 to 7 small towns. So all of those small towns were really small towns, but they were serving a tourist flow of about 100,000 people per week flowing in and out of there. So they ended up having a very large population, but it was transient. So as a government, we were put in a very difficult position of needing to support more and more services and manage larger challenges than a lot of our budgets and resources could handle. Now, my role was in emergency services. So I coordinated all of our paramedic response units and all of our emergency medical response in general. And that was my role as the chief up there. And we ended up having a very, very large population that kept us extremely busy. And that's why we became more and more of an enterprise-based environment than a tax-based, because 10,000 people plus the tourism tax dollars weren't enough to sustain what we needed to do. So we had to evolve our model to think more as a private enterprise than as a government. And we became highly successful doing that. But that gave us challenges that we had to work with as well within our workforce. We think about the plight of a lot of the resort areas around the world, and that plight's very simple. The workforce can't afford to live in most of those areas. So everybody that worked for me, myself included, commuted from other counties in there to work because we either couldn't find housing or there wasn't a livable wage for what the county needed for income. So those were some challenges I faced in that. And then over the last two and a half decades, as I worked more in the telecommunications and utility space for, from the software and data management perspective, the smaller regional providers is where I spent a good portion of my time. I worked with the large, what we call the tier 1 telephony companies around the world, names everybody's heard of. But I also did the majority of my time working for the smaller regional providers, and there are thousands of them around the world. A lot of people don't realize that. They think that, it's all wrapped up to 2 or 3 different cell providers or in-ground providers. No, there are hundreds or thousands of them around the world, and they face some very unique and distinct challenges to where they want to get that technology into the hands of the people in their regions. But the funding to make that happen, they need to go for grant funding. They need to rely on the government to help fund those vehicles to make that happen. If you're a telecom provider and your population of your subscriber base is, 2,000 people compared to a large conglomerate in America that has 140 million people, or one in India that has 4 to 5 times that number, you don't have the revenue at 2,000 subscribers to be able to put a lot of these advanced services in there, which enables the technology to get into the hands of your constituents or to your subscribers, which enables all of those services that ride on that technology to get. So as you get into more and more smaller communities, the ability to get those services just became more and more profound to me over the years to see that's a challenge. And they're being left behind. And how do we close that gap? How do we make sure that's not going to happen?
So, what are the biggest challenges regarding regional communities? What are the biggest challenges you see for them?
Biggest challenges. That's always the fun part because they're all big challenges. So how do we then look at that and segregate that out a little bit? And what I'd say first of all is that regional communities face a spectrum of challenges that really aren't understood or fully appreciated by people that live in larger urban and population centers. They're things that most of us take for granted. We think about safe living conditions, communications, reliable sources of food and water, ability to be connected to or create energy, access to industry and employment, access to livability norms, some of the things we talked about earlier with things like healthcare and education. These are all factors that are stacked against these communities every day. That leads to one of the bigger challenges they face, which is that thing we talked about earlier as well, that declining population through urbanization. So those are some of the bigger factors, I think, that really challenge these communities, not only to succeed, but just to survive. How often do you hear in the Western markets, we hear a great deal about international conglomerates coming in and purchasing a lot of those lands, a lot of those, what used to be family farms, a lot of those smaller industries, they get bought up and oftentimes relocated when it's possible to other areas where they get so heavily mechanized and dealt with in a different labor paradigm that those communities don't have a way to survive. So that's a problem. Those are all challenges. And as a Smart City Council task force, one of the things that we really need to look at is assessing how those communities can grow, enrich, and succeed and prosper in this type of a climate.
So after the dark side of regional communities, what is the bright side for regional communities? What are the biggest opportunities you see?
No, bigger opportunities, yes. I think regional communities as the undiscovered country, not to coin a term from a Star Trek movie from 2 or 3 decades ago, but those opportunities are numerous if you're willing to look. And the attraction can be very compelling. It can be some of the basic things like raising families in places where the air is clean, where the streets are safe. Even if they're not paved, they're still a good place to be. Public resources, if you look at the smaller regional communities, an interesting analysis of public resources can be pretty eye-opening. And I think about that as a dollars available per citizen, and dollars available per capita. So if you look at a large urban setting that shows a massive budget and more dollars per citizen than rural and regional settings, you think there's no comparison. But a micro view into those dollars really starts to change that complexion, because in the large, complex urban setting, you've got this web of infrastructure costs and overheads that have to go into all the things around public works and public safety and other services being provided, that those dollars per citizen start to actually decline down to or go below what's already available for the dollars that are available for those smaller rural areas. It's actually an interesting study to go through and look at that to find out that on the surface, it looks like a lot of dollars per person. It's really not. So public resources actually can be more targeted, more focused out in these areas. That's an opportunity. Industry can be very attracted to more regional settings. If you think about it, industry, especially post-pandemic, has had a major workforce problem, just trying to get people back to work. Out in the rural areas, that's been less of a problem. Workforce availability could be a very compelling reason for industry to move back out into those areas. I spent a lot of time in the Midwest in the United States, and driving across some of those areas, I'll go through these tiny little towns, and at the end of the town is a big factory. I look at that and I say, where did that come from? Well, that was a smart business that moved there, because now they've got a captive audience, a great workforce. They have a good cost of operations, a ratio to work with. And by the way, when they move there, these regional communities, these jurisdictions, they have incentives. They have tax incentives. They have grant funding available. They have vehicles there that make it very attractive for those industries to get out of the urban areas and get out to where those workforces are located. And that also, by the way, attracts and brings those workforces with it. So those are the kind of things that I think industry needs to take a look at and pay some attention to. So besides the lower cost of labor, the lower taxes, et cetera, those are all opportunities. And another opportunity is that technology enablement that we've been talking about. That remains top of mind, because the gap is widening right now between what's available between urban settings and regional settings. That gap is widening, and we're not closing it fast enough. It's not that the gap's not closing, it's that the technology is moving so fast that we're not able to keep up. I go into some of these areas and they're still working on 2.5 or 3G technology. Urban areas are in 5G. They're 20 years ahead of them. That used to be a 10-year gap. It's not 10 years anymore. Now it's 20. How do we start to close that? And think about this. Cities are consumers in the grand scheme of things. They don't really produce a lot. They consume an awful lot. Regional communities are the original providers of all of those things. Food doesn't grow on a farm in the middle of a city. Energy is not produced in the middle of a city. Raw materials are not sourced by digging up a public park. The more urbanization gathers momentum, the more need there's going to be for regional communities to be preserved and to grow and prosper.
What would you recommend for someone who would like to understand more about regional communities, the opportunities, the challenges which provide other opportunities?
Give us a call. It's not that simple, of course. It could be. Give us an email instead. But the bottom line here is reach out to the Smart Cities Council. Our Regional Communities Task Force is working with an increasing number of regional entities that are looking to access and even contribute to our resources to help them assess their own maturity across several factors, technology enablement that we've talked about, different types and availability of services. Where's their maturity in that continuum? Where are they at today? And then generate strategies to support that livability, workability, sustainability, those goals, and to understand how they can pursue and source and understand the nuances associated with funding vehicles, things like grants, for instance. Smart Cities Council offers a great deal of opportunity for those regional, rural, and remote communities to understand not only where they're at, but also help them form strategies and build ideas around where they want to go, because this is not a one-size-fits-all. Every community is going to be a little different. So how do we make sure that we understand and quantify and qualify where they're at today and present to them a series of goal opportunities and say which ones fit, or are there other ones you have in mind? And let's produce a strategy. We can bring in consulting expertise to help understand where they want to go and how they need to get there. There's a lot of communities, they want to get there. They just don't know what the steps are. And that's part of our value add, is to really close the gap on those steps as well. Let's help understand how to get there, and along the way, what are the changes? What are the wins? What are the places that are going to make a difference? What do those all look like? What are those milestones? Let's put that together.
John, you have been very generous with your time and answers. Do you have any closing comments or requests for the audience outside of giving us a call or shoot us an email?
The challenges that face rural communities today really differ across continents. It differs across countries. It differs across demographics. Our task force wants to attract regional and remote communities to join us to really ensure that we can provide those resources to support that wide variety of needs that persist around the globe. When we sit down and analyze what's happening in the outback in Australia versus what's happening deep in the continent in Latin America versus what's happening in the Midwest in the US versus what's happening in, fill in the blank on different regions around the world. They're all different. Their needs are all different, but there are commonalities. There are places where we can find opportunities for advancement and enrichment that we want to make sure that we're able to leverage. So closing request for the audience is think towards the future and look to us as a vehicle to help you get there. There's going to be a lot of ground to cover in that. And the journey is not going to be, not only not going to be cookie cutter, but it's not necessarily going to be easy, but it will be worthwhile. And it will absolutely be something that will benefit not just the younger generations, but the generations across the board. In these older communities, that's exactly what they are, older communities. So we want to turn that tide, and we want to find ways to have those communities be in a position to attract talent, attract youth, attract excitement and interest. And there's paths to do that we can help.
Thank you so much, John.
Thank you.
If you want to learn more about John, links will be provided in the show notes, and the Smart Cities Council website can inform you even more. What have you learned from this interview? What questions do you have after listening to John? What would you like to know more about? Let us know on the Smart Cities Council website or on LinkedIn. Look out for other episodes with the global thought leaders or topical discussions, and thanks for tuning in.